Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the third episode of the Let's Discuss Sports podcast. We have Rob Wilson, football finance expert from Sheffield Hallam University, with us, and we will be discussing various aspects regarding the title chase in the Premier League, the UEFA Champions League, the sacking of Claudio Ranieri, and Kepa Arrizabalaga reaction. Hello, Rob. How are you?
Hey, Sartak. Yeah, very good. Thanks. Looking forward to this.
So we have only 10 game weeks remaining until the end of the Premier League season. And the major question for me is what is the financial cost of a position in the Premier League? For example, say the difference between 4th and 5th place or 6th and 7th place.
Well, yeah, you're right. Business end of the season. All the teams are, going to be trying to optimise their performances to do exactly that, to try and climb up the league and get the highest finishing position. But there's this interesting misinterpretation of a placing, let's say. So in financial terms, the difference between 4th and 5th, or 5th and 6th, or 6th and 7th, is around about 1.2 to 1.5 million pounds. Not a huge amount at all. Add into that a little bit of additional games that they might have been shown on the television, some additional facility fees, that type of thing, and that might grow, let's say, to 2 million. But that's insignificant, isn't it, if you consider the context of the Premier League? The biggest issue is those clubs that are trying to compete into or get into the places that are going to contribute to European competition. So whilst the actual monetary difference between 5th and 4th might be 2 million, if you qualify in 4th, you get Champions League. Most English teams tend to get to the knockout phase of the Champions League. That was worth about 50 million. So whilst the actual monetary difference in Premier League terms is very small, the European implications are quite significant. And again, if you're 8th instead of 7th or 6th, and you miss out on Europa League, then obviously, whilst it's not 50 million, it will still be about 25 to 30, something like that. So it's that that's important. And then, right down at the bottom end of the table, again, difference between 16th and 17th is about 2 million, but then you're also missing out on 120 million quid the following season for your Premier League place. So, I say the monetary value of a place is small, but the impact of that place could be quite different.
Going down to the bottom end of the table, yesterday Fulham sacked Claudio Ranieri, and this is the second managerial change of the season.
Yeah.
I was having a look through their balance sheets from previous year, not the previous financial year, the last time the balance sheet was released, and the losses were somewhere around the range of 289 million pounds. Obviously, Manchester United has got a debt of 500 million pounds, but they are Manchester United, and this is Fulham, and Fulham are currently 19th in the league table and potentially facing relegation. So, if they are relegated, what will be the financial implications on them?
We've asked a couple of interesting questions in that bit of commentary, so I'll answer that last question first. They'll get a parachute payment if they get relegated.
Yeah.
Parachute payment, I think, will be worth something in order of about 40 million. Completely nonsense, if you ask me. It's Premier League's rewarding a failure, and philosophically and practically, actually, when you look at the data, parachute payments should just be abolished because it creates this imbalance that I know we've talked about previously in the Championship, so it will skew that position. So they will lose out on, let's say, 65 million pounds worth of revenue because of their Premier League status. That's obviously a big impact on their income statement.
I mean, I had a look at the wages of Fulham Football Club this morning, and last year they were paying 14 million pounds in wages to their players.
Yeah.
It increased 300% to 42 million pounds this year. And considering, I guess last year they received around 120 million after they were promoted from the Championship.
Yeah.
They spent all of that in transfers, and they're potentially running debts again.
They were really aggressive, weren't they, last summer? They invested essentially all of their Premier League payment in transfer fees. They would have obviously had to pay Premier League wages. But one of the things we are starting to see, particularly with new clubs in the Premier League, is they tie players to relegation clauses. So typically you would expect, if a Premier League contract is worth 100%, then you would typically expect them to earn about 30% of that value in the Championship. So their wages would drop by 70%. And where that has happened, we've seen clubs survive in the Championship where you have players that are still tied to an old Premier League contract, as quite famously at Sunderland, Jack Rodwell was still tied to his Premier League deal, about 70 grand a week, when they were playing at the bottom end of the Championship. That's a huge, huge liability on a balance sheet, although that's not the correct use of the terminology. You know exactly what I mean. And that kind of really destabilises the club. Just going back to some of the things you just opened up that little discussion with about Ranieri being sacked, I think that is absolutely bonkers that you would employ somebody for 100 days that was already in charge of a ship that was essentially sinking. You might argue that he hasn't had the bounce effect that you would normally get with some sort of managerial change. And the data that we've got at the university that I know you've seen would suggest you normally get a short-term spike when you make a change. That obviously hasn't happened at Fulham. But that's still a massive call and will be costly. So they have spent a lot of money. They're now going to spend a bit more money. They've got to get a new manager in. I think they're probably looking at how they consolidate over the summer and then give it a good run in the Championship. And of course, they'll be in a much better position to do that with all the riches they've got from the Premier League coming down.
I mean, about the Championship season, it is also coming to an end. And we have spoke about like Fulham getting 120 million. Like, it is called the promised land for the Championship teams, the Premier League. Yeah. And also the National League season is coming to an end, which is the non-league, obviously, the level below step 4. So what does financially a promotion for a non-league team mean to League 2?
It's not anything like you might expect when we start talking about 120 million in the Premier League. Last time we totted it up and did some average calculations for those National League clubs coming into League 2, you're talking about 300,000-ish in terms of the merit payment that they get from the Premier League. Creeps up to about $1.5 million by the time we get to League 1, and there might be, let's say, 7 million by the time we get to the Championship. So in comparison to the Premier League, it is absolutely peanuts. But that said, $250,000, 300,000 to an old National League club is quite significant. I think there's almost a bigger challenge for those clubs because they're coming from very, very small budgets and they're then having to compete with teams that have been around in League 2 for some time, and it makes it very difficult for them to compete unless they get some sort of cash injection from a sponsor or some sort of capital investment from an owner. But because of financial fair play, you get much less of that happening.
We have recently seen Notts County, they can't pay 200 grand a year. Yeah. And on the other hand, Manchester City has signed 650 million kid deal, which is bonkers. Yeah. And so what does it potentially mean for Notts County if they go into administration?
Well, ultimately, what we're talking about there is the first principles of finance. It's selling price higher than cost. Can you pay debts as they fall due? It doesn't matter if you're a Premier League team, a Championship, League 1, League 2, National League, part-time. Grassroots team that I run has the same problems. We have to balance budgets. Our income has to meet our expenditure or indeed exceed it. And if we borrow some money from a supplier, then we have to pay that on time. Notts County haven't done that. They would have undertaken a series of strategic options to try and make sure that they didn't get into the position they're in. Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs have got a responsibility to reclaim tax. We've got something called the Football Creditors Rule, which means football-related parties get paid first, which has meant that HMRC have been the ones to instigate a winding up order because it means they get their money first. As a UK taxpayer, I think that's what they should be doing. As a football fan, you never like to see a club go into administration or to be faced with winding up petitions. Ultimately, they could go out of business completely. We very rarely see that in professional football. There is always somebody out there that wants to acquire a club. I think the closest one we got to recently was probably Bolton Wanderers that really didn't go so well and are trying to re-establish themselves now. I would expect there'll be some sort of fundraising. They'll find the 200k and they'll stave off that administration threat for a little while longer.
Now, speaking about the financial implications, recently Chelsea Football Club faced a transfer ban for signing players they never play. And should they choose to contest the ban, there will be obviously legal costs associated with it. Yeah. But should the ban stay on Chelsea Football Club, what does it financially mean to the club?
There's an interesting... I was talking to somebody from a national newspaper about this very topic this morning, and I know you're a Chelsea fan, I think.
Yeah, I'm a Chelsea fan.
So you might not like this message, but let's serve it up anyway. The FA, the EPL, have got a responsibility to protect the integrity of the competition. And in my view, there are a number of clubs that have been abusing that system. Chelsea have been charged with recruiting players underage and doing some things that you're not allowed to do. They're not the only ones, as far as we're aware, but they are the first ones. And I think they're the first ones because of the sheer scale of their operations, so the number of loan deals that they have, the development of those players. And just take a step back from that. As a business strategy, it's actually quite smart because you can get these players in very young. They see Chelsea Football Club. They get blinded by the glitz and the glamour. When they get to 18, they can get some fairly lucrative contracts because they're established in the Premier League. No one gets near them. They can then farm them out on loan, increase their value, and more than recover their costs. So they're using it as a production line, essentially. It's a manufacturing plant that is producing products that other people are then buying. They buy them for a premium, and that then goes into Chelsea's transfer strategy. So from a business point of view, you can understand why they want that model to operate. From a moral and ethical and, dare I say, a legal aspect, though I'm not a legal expert, it would suggest that they've been breaking the rules, and so have a couple of other clubs. But to go to your question, what's going to be the financial impact of that? That could be significant, because if they can't sign players for 2 transfer windows, let's assume the ban stays, that threatens their on-pitch playing performance. And we've just talked about the fact that the finishing 4th can generate you £50 million worth of additional revenue when you play in the Champions League. So if they're competing against 5 other teams, because there are 6 that are right up there, those 5 other teams can invest in the transfer market, should naturally be able to improve their playing performance. So actually, whilst the cost to Chelsea might be missed revenue of 50 million, the gap is actually 100, because they've missed 50 and someone else has earned that. Now that's 2, 3, 4 players, so it makes a big difference for your playing squad potentially. So longer term could have quite a profound impact on the development and enhancement of Chelsea's squad and ultimately their playing position.
Let us now shift towards the football side of things.
You didn't like that, do you?
I didn't like that, but you have to accept the harsh truth. We have seen Chelsea loaning out players for years, ever since I remember.
Yeah.
Now, speaking about Chelsea on the football side of things, what do you think about Kepa Arrizabalaga becoming the manager of Chelsea in the last minutes of League Cup final?
Yeah. One thing we don't have for that is all the information around that case, do we? I'm sure you saw it. I saw it on the television. My interpretation was they thought he was injured, went to make a substitution. Only the manager and that team know whether or not that was a planned substitution. As an impartial fan on that day, Caballero should have come on. He's a penalty specialist. He used to play for Man City. If nothing else, those Man City players taking those penalties would have had a little doubt in their mind, might have changed their mind and missed a penalty. So the game outcome could have been very, very different. But let's park that because it didn't happen. What we actually saw was a player perceiving that they had sufficient power to tell a manager, I don't need to be substituted. Now, whether that was because of an injury or not is kind of immaterial in this context. In 3 or 4 minutes of live football, Kepa demonstrated the issue that has blighted Chelsea Football Club for years and years and years, and that is the short-term nature of their managerial tenure. So the players have got used to this managerial churn, and they know that if they step out of line or they misbehave or something goes in a different way to them, that enough of the players can almost force that pressure on a manager, and ultimately the manager is the one that gets relieved of his job. And I'm sure you'll be able to recall a number of instances over the last 5-6 years where that player power has got quite strong and a manager has then
Louis Philippe Scolari, Andre Villas-Boas,
yeah,
Jose Mourinho's second term,
yeah,
Antonio Conte to an extent,
yeah,
probably Sarri as well.
But it shows you, doesn't it, how the manager should have ultimate power in that dynamic and in that relationship. And what you've got at Chelsea is a historical narrative that says that manager's not going to be around for that long, so it doesn't actually matter. And if I step out of line, it's the manager that ultimately is going to carry the can. And will do in this case. He benched him on Wednesday night. He might bench him for a couple more weeks yet. Ultimately, though, that guy cost 70 million quid. Will be back in that, and he's a talented goalkeeper. Will be back in that side. And as soon as he comes back into the side, you know exactly what the press are going to say, and then they will get this polarisation of opinion. You know, is the manager in charge or are the players in charge? And unfortunately, I think the model that Sarri is doing is probably the right one. It's just having teething problems. Same with Guardiola at Man City.
I mean, like, if Sarri was the manager of, say, Manchester United or Liverpool, or if... I am just imagining, like, what would have happened if Sir Alex Ferguson was there. He substituted Kepa Arrizabalaga and he threw in a fit on the pitch. Probably killed him.
Well, I don't think it would have happened. But I don't think it would have happened because the managerial power has got a higher degree of integrity. Because those managerial changes are less frequent. In some of the clubs, they are only slightly less frequent, but they are less frequent. And Chelsea's kind of got this reputation for hiring and firing. As a number of Premier League clubs, they're not on their own in that. And it's that power dynamic that determines what happens. So, you know, would it have happened with Alex Ferguson? Absolutely not. But it's a completely different cultural context and the power that he had in that dressing room. Could it have happened with another Manchester United manager? Possibly. We don't know because we haven't seen it. And that I think for me, if I was on the board of directors at Chelsea, that says there's a bigger problem that they need to address, and that is hiring and firing that they've been doing the right way. And go back to one of your earlier questions about the transfer ban. If I was the Chelsea board now, I'd be looking at Sarri and thinking, we're going to get this transfer ban. I think they're resigned to the fact it's going to happen, whether or not they appeal or not. If they do have a 2-window transfer ban, what is the point in changing the manager? Because nobody can come in and change anything unless they're already going to Solskjaer at Manchester United, where the raw talent is in the squad. All those managers want to add to the squad. So anybody coming into Chelsea now is hamstrung from day one. So I think they'll stick with him, and I think gives them an opportunity to stick with him and see what happens.
And also, speaking about, like, since the game was on live television, what message does it send out to kids who play football on weekends?
It's far from ideal, isn't it? You know, I've got an 11-year-old son. He asked me what on earth was going on because in his Sunday League side, if his manager tells him he's coming off, he's sprinting off because he knows that that's what you have to do. It was not a good advert for the football club. They have come out with some narrative to try and explain what happened. You know, there is a brand value attached to that. They need to make sure that they're not those images aren't heralded for too much longer. And you know, I think what we saw by the benching of him on Wednesday has probably nipped it in the bud slightly, which is, I think, important for their kind of longer-term progress with sponsors and that type of thing.
So, few more questions before we end the podcast, and one of this is, do you think this will finally be Liverpool's year?
No. No. I think Man City have had their little blip. I think they're rediscovering some form. There's something in me that says Man City will end up winning it by 4 or 5 points.
And also some predictions on who will win the Champions League, the Europa League, and the other big 5 leagues.
Right, so let's start with Champions League. I think is wide open. I would say the same for the Europa League, and we've seen, haven't we, over the last couple of rounds of fixtures that for me at least, nobody's really coming through and saying we're the team to beat here. Some people will look at Paris and think they played well against Manchester United. I don't think they did. I think the 2 injuries that Manchester United got allowed Paris to play. I think a rather questionable refereeing decision not to book one of the players early on in the game backfired because he ultimately then went on and scored. I don't think Paris played particularly well. Mbappe was incredible, but other than that, I don't think Paris have really stepped up. Juventus are going to have an easy season. They'll win their league. Bayern Munich will have an easy season. They'll win their league. And because of those...
We have seen like Dortmund finally bottling it.
The issue, you go back to competitive balance theory, those Juventus and Bayern Munich are so strong in those divisions. I'll put my house on the fact that both those teams are going to win their respective domestic leagues. And because they're going to do that, that takes the pressure off a little bit, which means they can focus on the Champions League. So I think Juventus certainly will be right out there this year. Spain will be interesting. You know, it's going to be the Real Madrid-Barcelona show, and we'll see how that pans out. I think what will be really important is the next 2 or 3 weeks of that championship to see where that ends up going. Who haven't we covered? So Man City for the EPL, Paris in France, Juventus in Italy, Bayern Munich in Germany. I don't know. I wouldn't bet on the Spanish league just yet.
Thanks for your time, Rob.
My
It's
pleasure.
nice recording with you.
Anytime.